The lone shot echoed across Willow Creek, Montana, as the grave of Henry Richards was lowered into the hard prairie soil of 1872. Winifred Richards stood stoically under a black veil, her slender fingers clutching a handkerchief that had long since absorbed all her tears. At 32, she was now responsible for the struggling cattle ranch her husband had left behind, a ranch that was one bad season away from ruin. The townsfolk whispered behind cupped hands as they departed the cemetery. Poor widow Richards. How would she manage alone? A woman couldn't run Whispering Pines Ranch. Everyone knew that. The place needed a man's touch, a strong back, and the business sense that women supposedly lacked. Winifred heard their murmurs but kept her chin high as Pastor Miller offered final condolences. Mrs. Richards, please remember the church is here for you in your time of need, he said, clasping her gloved hand in both of his. Thank you, Pastor, she replied, her voice steady despite the hollow feeling in her chest. But I'll manage. Of course, he nodded, though his expression suggested otherwise. But should you need assistance with the ranch? Winifred knew what was coming next. It had been only 3 months since Henry had succumbed to pneumonia, but already the proposals had begun, veiled at first, then increasingly direct as the weeks passed. My nephew Thomas is looking to settle down. Fine young man with experience in cattle. Perhaps I could arrange a meeting. Winifred extracted her hand from his grasp. That's very thoughtful, Pastor, but I'm not interested in remarrying. Not now, perhaps not ever. The pastor's smile tightened. Mrs. Richards, a woman alone cannot thank you for the service, she interrupted, turning toward her waiting wagon. Good day. The ride back to Whispering Pines was solitary and quiet, just Winifred and the elderly ranch hand, Mr. Gunderson, who'd worked for Henry's father before him. The old man drove the wagon with arthritic hands, saying nothing but occasionally casting worried glances her way. When they crested the hill overlooking the ranch, Winifred felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The main house, weathered but proud, stood alongside a barn in need of repairs. The corral fences sagged in places, and the cattle herd, once 300 strong, had dwindled to less than 100 head after Henry's illness had prevented proper management during the harsh winter. I'll see to the horses, Mrs. Richards, Gunderson said as they pulled up to the house. Thank you, Mr. Gunderson, she replied, gathering her skirts to step down. Will you join me for supper later? The old man shook his head. Need to check on that broken section of fencing in the north pasture before dark. He hesitated, then added, Begging your pardon, madam, but we're going to need help. More hands. Winifred nodded. I know. I'll ride into town tomorrow to see about hiring someone. Inside the empty house, Winifred removed her black bonnet and veil, hanging them on the peg by the door. 5 years ago, she and Henry had arrived here as newlyweds, full of hope for their future. Now, at the kitchen table where they'd shared so many meals, she spread out the ranch ledgers and confronted the harsh reality of numbers that refused to add up favorably. The mortgage payment to the bank was due in 2 weeks. The cattle wouldn't bring enough at market until fall. There was barely enough money to hire one hand, let alone the 3 or 4 they truly needed. Winifred rubbed her temples, fighting back a fresh wave of grief and worry. She'd been a schoolteacher before marrying Henry, educated enough to understand the dire financial situation, but lacking the practical experience to solve it all alone. Mourning brought no relief. After a simple breakfast, Winifred changed into her simplest riding skirt and mounted her mare, Penny, for the 8-mile ride to town. Willow Creek was small but growing, with a main street boasting a general store, saloon, bank, and doctor's office. The railroad had come through 3 years prior, bringing new settlers and opportunities for men, at least. Her first stop was the bank, where the news was as expected. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Richards," said Mr. Blackwood, the portly banker, from behind his desk, "but I cannot extend further credit. The ranch is already mortgaged to capacity." "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Blackwood," Winifred said firmly. "Just time. The herd will bring good money in the fall if I can keep the ranch going until then." Blackwood leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. "Mrs. Richards, be reasonable. You have no experienced hands, no foreman, no husband to manage affairs." He folded his hands over his protruding stomach. "Several men in town would be willing to take the burden off your shoulders. Mr. Peterson, for instance, has expressed interest in both the ranch and a more permanent arrangement." Winifred's back stiffened. Edgar Peterson was a land speculator who'd been eyeing Whispering Pines for years, waiting for Henry's health to fail. "The ranch is not for sale, and neither am I," she replied coldly. Blackwood sighed dramatically. "Then I'm afraid I can't help you. Unless you find a husband to co-sign by the next payment date, I'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." Winifred left the bank with her head high but her spirits low. At the general store, she placed a modest order for supplies, carefully counting out coins from her dwindling funds. "Anything else, Mrs. Richards?" asked Mrs. Crawford, the storekeeper's wife. "Actually, yes. I'd like to post a notice for ranch hands," Winifred replied. Mrs. Crawford's eyebrows rose. "Ranch hands? But surely you're not planning to—" "I am planning to run my ranch," Winifred interrupted firmly. "Could I have some paper, please?" The woman reluctantly provided paper and pencil. Winifred wrote a simple advertisement. "Experienced ranch hands needed at Whispering Pines. Fair wages, room and board provided." She hesitated, then added, "Inquire with Mrs. Winifred Richards," underlining Mrs. to make her position clear. As she pinned the notice to the community board, the bell above the store's door jangled. Winifred turned to see Sheriff Mills entering with a man she'd never seen before, tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly beneath a well-worn Stetson. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but even through the road grime, she could tell he carried himself with quiet confidence. "Mrs. Richards," the sheriff nodded in greeting. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Zachary Morgan, just arrived on the eastbound train." The stranger touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Madam," he said, his voice a pleasant baritone with the slightest hint of a Texas drawl. Winifred nodded politely but turned back to her notice. She had no time for social niceties, not with the ranch's future hanging in the balance. "Mr. Morgan's looking for work," the sheriff continued. "I saw him reading your notice outside." This caught Winifred's attention. She turned back, evaluating the man more carefully. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with intelligent blue eyes that met hers directly, not challenging but not deferential either. "You have ranching experience, Mr. Morgan?" she asked. "Yes, madam. Worked cattle in Texas, Colorado, and Wyoming." He spoke simply, without boasting. "Was foreman on the Circle T near Fort Worth for 3 years. "And why did you leave that position?" A shadow passed over his features. "Owner's son took over. We had different ideas about running things." Winifred considered him. She needed help desperately, but hiring a stranger carried risks. "Whispering Pines can't offer much in wages right now, Mr. Morgan. We've fallen on hard times." "So I gathered," he replied, nodding toward her notice. "But I'm not looking to get rich, Mrs. Richards. Just need honest work." Sheriff Mills cleared his throat. "I can vouch for him insofar as he's no wanted man, Winifred. Checked his papers myself." Winifred made her decision. "Very well, Mr. Morgan. If you're willing to accept payment partly in room and board until after we bring cattle to market, the position is yours. I warn you, There's much to be done and few hands to do it. Morgan nodded. When would you like me to start? Can you ride out with me today? If her quick decision surprised him, he didn't show it. Yes, madam. Just need to collect my gear from the station. An hour later, they were riding side by side toward Whispering Pines, Morgan leading a pack horse loaded with his belongings. He changed into fresh clothes before departing town, still worn but clean. Winifred appreciated that small sign of respect. "How many hands are working the ranch currently?" he asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Just Mr. Gunderson, who's been with us since my husband's father owned the land. He's knowledgeable but getting on in years." Winifred hesitated, then decided honesty was necessary. "My husband died 3 months ago, Mr. Morgan. The ranch has suffered in his absence." Morgan absorbed this information without comment, his eyes scanning the landscape. "Good land," he observed eventually. "Plenty of water, decent grazing. How many head are you running?" "Just under 100 now. We lost nearly 200 during winter and early spring." He nodded thoughtfully. "Disease or predators?" "Neither. Poor management," Winifred admitted. "Henry was ill for months before he passed. We couldn't afford extra hands and She trailed off. "You did your best," Morgan finished for her, his tone matter of fact rather than pitying. They rode the rest of the way in silence, cresting the final hill as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Whispering Pines. Morgan surveyed the property with a critical but not unkind eye. "Barn roof needs work," he observed. "Corral fence too, but the house looks solid." Winifred felt a strange mix of defensiveness and relief at his assessment. "Yes, well, we've had to prioritize." As they approached the main house, Mr. Gunderson emerged from the barn, his weathered face creasing with curiosity. "Mrs. Richards," he called, limping slightly as he approached. "Didn't expect you back so soon." "Mr. Gunderson, this is Zachary Morgan. He's joining us as a ranch hand." Winifred dismounted, handing Penny's reins to Morgan while she greeted the old man. Gunderson sized up the newcomer with suspicion. "Where you from, mister?" "Texas originally," Morgan replied, dismounting smoothly and extending his hand. "But I've worked ranches across 3 territories." The old man grunted, accepting the handshake reluctantly. "What brings you to Montana?" "Work," Morgan replied simply, "and a change of scenery." Winifred interrupted before Gunderson's interrogation could continue. "Mr. Morgan will take the room in the bunkhouse. Could you show him there while I prepare supper?" "I can see to my own accommodations," Morgan offered. "And my horses too, if you'll point me to the corral." His independence was refreshing after months of townsfolk treating her like she couldn't manage without a man's help. Winifred nodded. "Very well. Supper's at 6. We can discuss the work that needs doing afterward." Over a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread, Winifred observed her new employee. Morgan ate with good appetite but good manners, answering Gunderson's gruff questions with patience. He didn't volunteer much about himself beyond his work experience, which included not just cattle ranching, but also a stint breaking horses for the Army. "Tomorrow I'd like to ride the property," he said, addressing Winifred directly. "Get a sense of what we're working with." Gunderson raised a bushy eyebrow. "The ranch," Morgan clarified, meeting the old man's gaze steadily. "I work for Mrs. Richards now." "That makes Whispering Pines my responsibility too." Winifred felt an unexpected warmth at his words. "Mr. Gunderson can show you the boundaries," she said. "I've business to attend to here." Morgan nodded. "Fair enough, but I'd like you to ride with us soon, madam." "Show me what your vision is for the place." "My vision?" Winifred was taken aback. "Yes, madam, it's your ranch. You must have ideas about how you want it run." No one had asked her that before. Even Henry, though loving and respectful, had always made the decisions about the ranch operations. "I suppose I do," she said slowly, "though I'm still learning much about cattle ranching." "We all start somewhere," Morgan said with a slight smile that transformed his serious face. "I didn't know a branding iron from a frying pan when I started cowboying at 16. That night, lying in bed, Winifred found herself thinking about Zachary Morgan. There was something different about him compared to the other men in town. He'd asked what her vision was, as if her opinion mattered. As if the ranch truly was hers to direct, not just a burden she was expected to surrender to the first man who offered marriage. The next morning, Winifred woke to the unfamiliar sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and found Morgan already at work repairing the corral fence, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms browned by years in the sun. "Mr. Morgan," she called, approaching the fence. "You're up early." He paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the morning coolness. "Habit, madam. Day starts at dawn on a working ranch." "You needn't tell me," she replied with a small smile. "I've been up at dawn since I married Henry 6 years ago." "Of course," he nodded, looking slightly abashed. "I didn't mean to imply, no offense taken," Winifred assured him. "I appreciate your initiative. There's coffee in the kitchen when you're ready." Over the next 2 weeks, Winifred watched in amazement as Morgan transformed Whispering Pines. He worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing fences, patching the barn roof, and riding the range to check on cattle. He was respectful but never deferential, treating her as the ranch owner but never as someone incapable because of her gender. Most surprising were the conversations they began having each evening after supper, when Gunderson had retired to his cabin and they sat on the porch with coffee. Morgan would report on the day's work, but he'd also ask questions, seeking her input on decisions. "The southwest pasture's getting low on grass," he said one evening. "I'm thinking we should move the herd to the North Range next week." "That makes sense," Winifred agreed, then hesitated. "But Henry always waited until June to use that pasture." Morgan nodded thoughtfully. "Any particular reason why?" He said the grass was sweeter then, made for better weight gain before market. "That's good thinking," Morgan acknowledged. "But with fewer cattle this year, we might be better served preserving the closer pastures for later in the season." Less riding time means more working time. They discussed the options, weighing pros and cons, and in the end, Winifred made the decision to try Morgan's approach. It struck her later that night how different this was from her marriage. Henry had been a good man, but he'd never consulted her on ranch operations, assuming she had no interest or aptitude for such matters. As the mortgage payment deadline approached, however, Winifred's anxiety increased. Despite Morgan's valuable help, the fundamental problem remained. They needed money, and quickly. "Mr. Morgan," she said one evening as they reviewed the cattle count, "I need to be frank with you. The bank payment is due in 3 days, and we're short by nearly $100. Morgan frowned. "That's a substantial amount." "Yes, Mr. Blackwood at the bank has made it clear he won't extend further credit unless—" She trailed off, embarrassed. "Unless," Morgan prompted gently. Winifred sighed. "Unless I marry." Apparently, a woman's signature isn't sufficient guarantee of payment. Morgan's expression darkened. "That's not right." "Perhaps not, but it's reality." Winifred closed the ledger. "I've had no shortage of marriage proposals since Henry died." The banker himself suggested Edgar Peterson. "The land speculator," Morgan's voice had a sharp edge. "He's got a reputation for acquiring distressed properties at a fraction of their worth." "I'm well aware," Winifred said dryly. "He's proposed 3 times, each offer lower than the last. He knows exactly how desperate my situation is becoming." Morgan was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "What if I just help?" he finally asked. Winifred looked at him in confusion. "You already are helping, Mr. Morgan, more than I could have hoped." "No, I mean with the bank," he clarified. "What if I co-sign the loan extension? I have some savings from my foreman days, not enough to cover the whole amount, but perhaps enough to show good faith." Winifred stared at him, astonished. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." Morgan met her gaze steadily. "I know enough. I know you're working harder than anyone to save this ranch. I know you've refused easier paths that would have cost you your independence. And I know Whispering Pines could be prosperous again with time and proper management. But co-signing would put your savings at risk," Winifred protested. He shrugged. "Sometimes you have to risk something to gain something worthwhile." The next day, they rode into town together to meet with Blackwood. The banker was startled by their proposal, but couldn't find legitimate grounds to refuse once Morgan presented his savings and references. "This is most irregular," Blackwood muttered as he prepared the paperwork. "A female ranch owner and a hired hand with no property as collateral." "Mr. Morgan is more than a hired hand," Winifred corrected firmly. "He's the ranch foreman now." Morgan glanced at her in surprise. This was news to him, but nodded in agreement. Blackwood's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Foreman, you say? And what exactly is the nature of your arrangement?" Winifred felt heat rise to her cheeks at the implied impropriety. "Our arrangement, Mr. Blackwood, is strictly professional. Mr. Morgan manages the ranch operations while I handle the business affairs. Now, shall we proceed with the loan extension, or should I take my business to the bank in Helena?" Blackwood's mouth tightened, but he pushed the papers across the desk. 6 months, Mrs. Richards, not a day more." Outside the bank, Winifred released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan, that buys us precious time. Please," he said with a slight smile, "if I'm your foreman now, you might as well call me Zachary." "Zachary," she tried the name, finding she liked the sound of it. "And I'm Winifred, though most call me Winnie." "Winnie," he repeated. Something in his tone made her look up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "It suits you." As they walked down Willow Creek's main street, Winifred became uncomfortably aware of the stares and whispers following them. Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Lambert stood outside the millinery, their heads close together as they tracked Winifred's progress with Zachary. "People are talking," she murmured. Zachary nodded slightly. "Small towns always do. Does it bother you?" "It shouldn't," Winifred admitted, "but it does somewhat. Not for myself, but it could affect the ranch's standing." Before Zachary could respond, a heavy-set man with an expensive suit and pomaded hair stepped into their path. "Mrs. Richards," he said with exaggerated courtesy, tipping his hat. "What a pleasant surprise." "Mr. Peterson," Winifred acknowledged coolly. "I'm afraid we're in a hurry." Edgar Peterson's gaze shifted to Zachary, sizing him up with obvious contempt. "And who might this be?" "Zachary Morgan, foreman of Whispering Pines." Zachary introduced himself, extending a hand that Peterson ignored. "Foreman, how interesting." Peterson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I hadn't heard you were hiring, Mrs. Richards, especially given your financial constraints." "My business affairs are not town gossip, Mr. Peterson," Winifred replied sharply. "On the contrary, my dear." Peterson leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They're of great interest to me. My offer still stands, though I must warn you its terms may become less generous as your situation deteriorates." Zachary stepped forward, his body language subtly protective without being possessive. "Mrs. Richards has secured an extension on her loan, Mr. Peterson. Whispering Pines is not for sale." Peterson's face reddened. "I see. Well, extensions only postpone the inevitable for operations that can't sustain themselves." He looked pointedly at Winifred. When you're ready to discuss a more permanent solution, my door is always open. A woman alone faces so many difficulties. As Peterson walked away, Winifred felt a mixture of anger and validation. "Now you understand why I've refused so many proposals," she said as they continued toward the general store. "They don't want me, they want the land." "Not all men are like Peterson," Zachary replied quietly. "Perhaps not. But too many are." She glanced at him. "You're different." "How so?" Winifred considered the question carefully. "You asked how you could help, not how you could take over. There's a world of difference in that." At the general store, Winifred was relieved to find it empty except for Mrs. Crawford. They purchased necessary supplies, adding a few luxuries that had been absent from Whispering Pines for months: real coffee, sugar, and a small jar of blackberry preserves. My, Mrs. Crawford commented as she wrapped their purchases. "Things must be looking up at the ranch." "They are indeed," Winifred replied with more confidence than she truly felt. As they loaded the supplies onto their horses, Zachary asked, "Would you mind if we visited the saloon before heading back? I'd like to ask around about potential ranch hands now that we've secured the extension." Winifred hesitated. The Silver Dollar Saloon was not a place respectable women frequented in Willow Creek. Seeing her discomfort, Zachary quickly added, "Or I could meet you at the church in an hour. Pastor Miller mentioned a harvest social when we passed him earlier." The thought of attending the social and facing more thinly veiled proposals from the town's eligible bachelors was decidedly unappealing. "No," Winifred decided, straightening her shoulders. "I'll accompany you to the saloon. This is business, and I should be involved in hiring decisions." The Silver Dollar fell silent as they entered, conversations halting mid-sentence as all eyes turned to them. Winifred held her head high, ignoring the stares as Zachary led her to a corner table, positioning himself so she faced away from the bar. "What can I get you folks?" The bartender approached, eyeing Winifred with surprise. "Coffee for the lady, whiskey for me," Zachary replied. "And information if you've got it. We're looking to hire experienced hands at Whispering Pines." The bartender raised his eyebrows. "Heard that place was on its last legs." "You heard wrong," Winifred interjected firmly. "We're expanding operations." Their drinks arrived, and gradually several men approached the table, drawn by the prospect of work. Zachary asked direct, knowledgeable questions about their experience, while Winifred observed and occasionally added her own queries. By the time they left, they had arranged for 2 men to ride out to the ranch the following day for final interviews. "That was productive," Zachary commented as they mounted their horses for the journey home. Winifred nodded, surprised at her own sense of accomplishment. "Yes, it was, though I suspect I've scandalized half the town by entering a saloon." Zachary smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his normally serious features. "You were magnificent. Direct, businesslike. No one could question your professionalism." "Except everyone will," Winifred laughed, finding she cared less than expected. "A widow and her unmarried foreman conducting business in a saloon. I'll be the subject of gossip for weeks." "Does that concern you?" he asked, his expression growing more serious. Winifred considered the question as they rode out of town. "Less than it would have a month ago," she admitted. Saving the ranch matters more than social niceties. The following weeks brought gradual but steady improvements to Whispering Pines. The 2 new hands brothers named Tom and Will Hayes proved reliable workers. With Zachary's guidance, they repaired fencing, treated sick cattle, and began preparations for the fall drive to market. Winifred found herself taking a more active role in ranch operations, riding out with Zachary several times a week to check the herd and learn the business side of cattle raising. Her evenings were spent studying animal husbandry books ordered from Denver, while her days increasingly involved physical labor alongside the men. One afternoon, as she helped brand a new calf under Zachary's instruction, Will Hayes shook his head in amazement. "Never thought I'd see a lady rancher who could throw a loop and work a branding iron," he commented. "Mrs. Richards is full of surprises," Zachary replied, his voice carrying a note of pride that made Winifred's cheeks warm. As summer progressed into early autumn, Winifred became aware of a subtle shift in her relationship with Zachary. Their evening conversations on the porch grew longer, often continuing well past sunset. They discussed not just ranch business but books, politics, and their pasts. She learned of his childhood in East Texas, his early years as a cowboy, and the personal code of honor that guided his actions. In turn, she shared stories of her time as a schoolteacher in St. Louis, her courtship with Henry, and her dreams for Whispering Pines. Zachary listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights without judgment. What Winifred didn't share, couldn't bring herself to voice, was her growing awareness of Zachary as more than just her foreman. She noticed the grace of his movements as he worked with horses, the intelligence in his blue eyes when he spoke of ranching strategies, and the rare but transformative nature of his smile. Such thoughts were dangerous. Henry had been gone barely 6 months. More practically, Zachary was her employee, and she'd finally gained the town's grudging respect as a businesswoman. Romantic entanglements would undermine everything she'd worked to establish. The cattle drive to the railhead in Helena was planned for late September. With nearly 100 head to move, all hands would be needed, including Winifred. "Are you certain about this?" Zachary asked as they finalized plans. "It's a 5-day journey each way, sleeping rough on the trail." "I'm certain," Winifred replied firmly. "These are my cattle, and I need to be present for the sale negotiations. Besides, you yourself said every hand would be needed." Zachary studied her face, then nodded. "Very well, but you should know what you're getting into. Long days in the saddle, cold nights, basic food, and no privacy to speak of." "I'm not some delicate city flower, Zachary," Winifred reminded him. "I've lived on this ranch for 6 years. Living on a ranch and driving cattle are different matters," he cautioned. "Then teach me what I need to know," she challenged. The next 2 weeks were filled with intensive preparation. Zachary taught Winifred the basics of driving cattle, including how to turn strays, manage stampedes, and communicate through whistle signals. They practiced from dawn until dusk, until her muscles ached and her hands were raw despite her gloves. "You're a natural," Zachary commented one evening as they cooled down their horses after a particularly grueling session. "Most first-timers take twice as long to learn half as much." Winifred smiled at the compliment, though she suspected he was being generous. "I have a good teacher." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Zachary looked away first, clearing his throat. "We should head back. Early start tomorrow." The morning of the cattle drive dawned clear and cool. Winifred had traded her riding skirt for a pair of men's trousers modified to fit her slender frame, scandalous by town standards, but practical for the long journey ahead. She'd pinned her auburn hair tightly under her hat and wore a bandana to protect against dust. Zachary did a double take when she emerged from the house, but quickly masked his surprise. "Ready?" he asked, handing her the reins to Penny, who was outfitted with saddlebags containing Winifred's few personal items. "Ready," she confirmed, mounting with practiced ease. The first day passed in a blur of dust, bellowing cattle, and constant vigilance. Winifred was assigned to ride flank, keeping strays from wandering off the established trail. By sundown, Every muscle in her body protested, and her face was coated with a layer of dust turned to mud by perspiration. "How are you holding up?" Zachary asked as they made camp that night. Winifred attempted to straighten her aching back. "I'll survive," she said with determined cheerfulness, "though I may never walk normally again." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "First day's always the worst. You'll toughen up." He was right. By the third day, Winifred had found her rhythm, anticipating the cattle's movements and working in coordinated harmony with the other hands. The men, initially skeptical of having a woman on the drive, gradually came to accept and even respect her determination and quick learning. On the fourth night, camped alongside a small creek, Winifred sat alone by the fire after the others had turned in. Sleep eluded her despite her physical exhaustion, her mind too full of worries about the upcoming cattle sale and the future of Whispering Pines. "Penny for your thoughts," came Zachary's quiet voice as he settled beside her, offering a cup of coffee. Winifred accepted gratefully, warming her hands around the tin cup. "Just wondering what price we'll fetch in Helena," she admitted. "We need every dollar we can get." Zachary nodded. "The herd's looking good, better than when I arrived. We should get fair market value at minimum." "And if we don't?" the question had been haunting her. "Then we adjust and move forward," he replied simply. "That's all anyone can do." Winifred studied his profile in the firelight. "You say we so naturally," she observed, "as if Whispering Pines is your concern as much as mine." Zachary was silent for a long moment. "I suppose it has become that," he finally said, his voice low. "I care what happens to the ranch and to you." The admission hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Winifred's heart quickened. Zachary, a loud crack from the fire interrupted whatever she might have said. Zachary stood abruptly. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow's the last push to Helena." Helena's cattle yards were chaotic and overwhelming, filled with the stench of animals and the shouts of buyers and sellers. Winifred stayed close to Zachary as they negotiated with various buyers, grateful for his expertise and steady presence. By day's end, they had sold the entire herd for a price that exceeded Winifred's cautious hopes enough to pay off the loan extension, purchase supplies for winter, and still have a modest reserve for emergencies. "You did it," Zachary said as they counted the money in the privacy of their hotel room. They'd splurged on 2 adjoining rooms for their single night in Helena before the return journey. "We did it," Winifred corrected, looking up from the neat stacks of bills. "I couldn't have managed any of this without you, Zachary." Their eyes met across the small table, and this time, neither looked away. Something had shifted between them during the cattle drive, a deepening of trust, a recognition of mutual respect, and perhaps something more that neither had yet acknowledged aloud. "Winnie," Zachary said softly, using the nickname that had become natural to him over the months. "There's something I need to." A knock at the door interrupted him. Will Hayes called through the wood. "Boss, the Hayes brothers are heading to the saloon to celebrate. You and Mrs. Richards want to join." The moment broken, Zachary moved to the door. "I'll be along shortly," he called back. "Ask Mrs. Richards in about 10 minutes. When the footsteps retreated, Zachary turned back to Winifred. "We should talk," he said, "but perhaps not tonight. Get some rest, enjoy the celebration. We have a long ride home tomorrow." The return journey to Whispering Pines was quieter without cattle to drive, allowing for more conversation. Winifred found herself riding alongside Zachary for much of each day, discussing plans for the ranch's future. "We should consider breeding better stock next spring," she suggested. "Investing some of our profits in a few Hereford bulls to improve the herd." Zachary looked at her with approval. "That's good thinking. Herefords fetch better prices and handle our winters well." "I've been raiding," Winifred admitted. Agricultural journals from back east suggest crossbreeding with our existing stock could yield significant improvements within 2 generations. Their conversation flowed easily from business to more personal matters as the miles passed beneath their horses' hooves. By the time Whispering Pines came into view on the 5th day, Winifred realized with startling clarity that something fundamental had changed during their journey. She no longer saw Zachary as merely her employee or even her friend. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. That evening, after the men had settled into the bunkhouse and Winifred had bathed away the dust of travel, she sat alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. She heard Zachary's familiar footsteps before she saw him, climbing the porch steps with 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you might want this," he said, offering her one. "Thank you." Their fingers brushed as she accepted the cup, sending an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the hot beverage. Zachary leaned against the porch railing, facing her. "So," he said after a comfortable silence, "Whispering Pines has survived another season." "Thanks to you," Winifred acknowledged. "No," he shook his head. "Thanks to you. Your determination, your willingness to learn and adapt. Not many would have had the courage to do what you've done these past months." Winifred looked down at her coffee. "I had no choice. This ranch is all I have left of the life Henry and I built together." "Is that the only reason you fought so hard to keep it?" Zachary asked quietly. As a memorial to Henry, the question caught her off guard. No, not entirely," she admitted. "At first, perhaps, but now." She looked out at the land stretching before them, bathed in the fading light of day. "Now I love it for itself, for what it could become, for the life it represents." Zachary nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I've been thinking about my future," he said after a moment. Winifred's heart sank. She'd known this conversation might come eventually. With the cattle sold and winter approaching, many hands moved on to find work elsewhere. "I see," she said, striving to keep her voice neutral. "You'll be moving on, then?" "That depends." Zachary set his coffee down and took a step toward her. "On what you want." Winifred looked up, meeting his gaze. "What I want?" "Yes." Another step closer. "I could stay on as foreman if that's what you prefer, continue as we have been. And if that's not what I prefer—" The words came out barely above a whisper. Zachary knelt before her chair, bringing his face level with hers. "Then I'd ask what you do want, Winnie, because these past months have shown me what I want, and it's not just a job on a ranch." Winifred's pulse quickened. "What do you want, Zachary?" "You," he said simply. "A future with you. Not as your employee, but as your partner, in every sense." The directness of his words took her breath away. We barely know each other," she protested weakly. Zachary smiled. "We've worked side by side for nearly 6 months, faced hardships, celebrated successes. I'd say we know each other better than many married couples." "The town would talk," Winifred said, though she found she cared less about that prospect than she once had. "Let them," Zachary replied. "We've already given them plenty to gossip about." His expression grew serious. "I'm not proposing marriage, Winnie. Not yet. That would be too soon for both of us. I'm proposing possibility. Time to see if what I feel, what I think we both feel, can grow into something permanent." Winifred studied his face, seeing the earnestness there, the quiet strength that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "And if it doesn't work between us, what happens to Whispering Pines then?" "It remains yours," he said without hesitation. "Always. I'll sign any paper you want, making that clear. I don't want your land, Winnie. I want a chance to build something with you." In that moment, the contrast between Zachary and the other men who had pursued her since Henry's death couldn't have been clearer. They had seen a vulnerable widow with property to be acquired. He saw her strength, her determination, her value beyond what she owned. Winifred set her coffee cup aside and reached out, tentatively touching Zachary's weathered cheek. "I think," she said softly, "I would like to explore that possibility." His smile illuminated his entire face as he covered her hand with his own. "May I kiss you, Winnie Richards?" In answer, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened into something more certain. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Winifred felt a sense of rightness that had been absent from her life for too long. "What happens now?" she asked. Zachary took her hands in his. "Now we take each day as it comes. We work together, we learn about each other, and we see where this journey leads us." As winter settled over Whispering Pines, Winifred and Zachary's relationship deepened gradually. They maintained professional boundaries during working hours. She was still the ranch owner. He the foreman, but evenings were spent together, talking, rating, and slowly building a foundation of mutual understanding that went beyond physical attraction. The townsfolk of Willow Creek noticed, of course. Winifred's next trip to town with Zachary generated significant attention, much of it disapproving. Mrs. Crawford at the general store was particularly cold, making comments about proper mourning periods and unseemly haste. Edgar Peterson was more direct in his displeasure, cornering Winifred outside the bank one December afternoon. "I hear you've taken up with your hired help," he said, his tone making the words sound dirty. "How disappointing. A woman of your standing should aim higher." Before Winifred could respond, Zachary appeared at her side, having completed their business at the post office. "Problem here, Winnie?" he asked, his voice pleasant but with steel underneath. Peterson sneered. "Nothing that concerns a glorified cowhand." "On the contrary," Winifred replied coolly, "anything said to me concerns my foreman, especially insults delivered in public." She took Zachary's arm deliberately. "Good day, Mr. Peterson. I believe our business relationship is concluded." As they walked away, Zachary asked quietly, "Are you sure about that? Peterson has influence in town." "I'm sure," Winifred replied firmly. "Whispering Pines is solvent now, thanks to our hard work. We don't need connections built on disrespect." Zachary's expression softened as he looked at her. "Do you know how remarkable you are, Winnie Richards?" Christmas at Whispering Pines brought unexpected joy. The main house was decorated with pine boughs and candles, and Winifred prepared a feast for all the ranch hands. Snow fell softly outside as they gathered around the table, a makeshift family brought together by circumstance but united by genuine affection. After the others had retired to the bunkhouse, Zachary remained, sitting with Winifred before the fireplace. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Merry Christmas," he said, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Winifred unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "I noticed you writing in your old one regularly," Zachary explained. "Thought you might need a new one soon." "It's perfect," she said, touched by his thoughtfulness. She reached beneath a cushion and produced her own gift, a silver pocket watch to replace the battered tin one he carried. As winter gave way to spring, Whispering Pines began to transform. With the profits from the previous year's cattle sale, they were able to hire additional hands, purchase breeding stock as Winifred had suggested, and make substantial improvements to the buildings and fencing. The banker, Mr. Blackwood, who had been so dismissive of Winifred's ability to manage the ranch, now greeted her with newfound respect when she made deposits rather than withdrawals. Even the townspeople who had gossiped about her relationship with Zachary gradually softened as it became clear that Whispering Pines was thriving under their joint management. By April, The question of Zachary's position at the ranch and in Winifred's life could no longer be avoided. They sat together on the porch one evening watching the sunset as had become their custom. "Winnie," Zachary began, taking her hand, "it's been nearly 9 months since I arrived here." "The best 9 months since Henry died," she replied softly. "For me as well," he agreed. "But I've been thinking about our arrangement. The hands talk, you know. They respect you, respect us both, but there's always going to be questions about what we are to each other." Winifred nodded slowly. "I've considered that too." "I love you," Zachary said simply. "I think I've loved you since that day at the bank when you stood up to Blackwood like you were the one with all the power, not him." Winifred's heart swelled. Though their feelings had been clear in actions and small intimacies, neither had spoken the words aloud until now. "I love you too," she replied. "And I'm not ashamed of it or worried about what others think anymore." Zachary smiled, but his expression remained serious. "Even so, there are practical considerations: the ranch's reputation, your standing in the community, the legal aspects of property ownership." "Are you building up to a proposal, Zachary Morgan?" Winifred asked, a teasing note in her voice masking deeper emotion. "I suppose I am, in my roundabout way," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. Then, his expression growing earnest, he knelt before her and took both her hands in his. "Winifred Richards, I didn't come to Whispering Pines looking for love, but I found it anyway. You're the strongest, most determined woman I've ever known. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled in Winifred's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Zachary pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When he finally released her, his eyes were suspiciously bright as well. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I've had this for a while, waiting for the right moment." He withdrew a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my mother's. I'd be honored if you'd wear it." As Winifred slipped the ring onto her finger, she thought of how far she had come from that grieving widow standing at Henry's graveside, determined but terrified of the future. She had found not just the strength to survive, but the courage to open her heart again. They were married in May, in a simple ceremony at Whispering Pines rather than the church in town. Pastor Miller officiated, having eventually come to accept Winifred's unconventional path. The ranch hands stood as witnesses, along with a few true friends from Willow Creek who had supported Winifred through her most difficult times. As she spoke her vows to Zachary, Winifred felt Henry's memory as a gentle presence rather than a shadow. She would always love him for the years they'd shared, but her heart had expanded to embrace a new love, one built on equal partnership and mutual respect. That evening, as twilight settled over the ranch that was now truly theirs together, Zachary and Winifred stood on the porch of the main house, their home. "Mrs. Morgan," Zachary said, testing the name. "Actually," Winifred replied with a smile, "I was thinking we might use Richards Morgan for the ranch. Honor the past while embracing our future together." Zachary nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Richards Morgan Ranch, I like the sound of that." "So do I," Winifred agreed, leaning into his embrace as the first stars appeared in the Montana sky. 1 year after their wedding, Whispering Pines, now officially Richards Morgan Ranch, hosted its first community gathering. A summer barbecue that brought together ranchers and townspeople from throughout the area. The improvements to the property were evident everywhere. New barn, expanded corrals, a bunkhouse that could accommodate the now permanent staff of 6 hands, and a main house with a fresh coat of paint and additional rooms under construction. As Winifred moved among their guests, she caught sight of Edgar Peterson standing somewhat apart from the others. observing the proceedings with poorly disguised envy. Beside him stood Mr. Blackwood, whose attitude toward the Richards Morgan enterprise had evolved from skepticism to grudging respect as their business continued to thrive. "Quite a spread you've built here," Peterson commented as Winifred approached with a tray of lemonade. Almost unrecognizable from the failing operation it was 2 years ago. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," Winifred replied pleasantly, offering him a glass which he took with reluctance. "We've been fortunate in our efforts." "Fortune had little to do with it, I suspect," he said, his gaze drifting to where Zachary stood near the barbecue pit, deep in conversation with several neighboring ranchers. "Your husband seems to have a good head for business." "We both do," Winifred corrected gently but firmly. "Our success comes from partnership, Mr. Peterson, something I suspect you know little about." Before he could formulate a suitably cutting response, she moved on, exchanging the empty tray for a full one offered by Anna, the young woman they'd hired to help in the house now that Winifred's pregnancy made certain tasks more challenging. At 5 months along, Winifred's condition was obvious beneath her summer dress, a source of private joy and public interest. Several of the women present had already cornered her with advice, predictions, and thinly veiled inquiries about whether the hasty marriage had proceeded or followed the conception. Questions Winifred deflected with practiced grace. Later, as the sun began to set and guests departed, Zachary found Winifred sitting on a bench beneath the old oak tree that shaded the side yard, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her abdomen. "Tired?" he asked, settling beside her. "A little," she admitted, "but happy. It was a good day." Zachary covered her hand with his own. "The best days are yet to come," he said, his voice warm with promise. And he was right. Their son, Samuel Henry Morgan, was born that November, a strong, healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, he was joined by a sister, Elizabeth Grace, completing their family and filling the once quiet ranch house with laughter and activity. As the children grew, so did the ranch. By 1880, Richards Morgan was one of the most prosperous operations in the territory, known for quality stock and fair business practices. Winifred and Zachary managed it as true partners, each bringing different strengths to their shared enterprise. On the 10th anniversary of the day Zachary had first arrived at Whispering Pines, they stood together on the porch at sunset, just as they had so many evenings before. Sam, now 7, and Lizzie, 5, played in the yard under the watchful eye of Anna, now the children's beloved nanny and an indispensable part of the household. "Did you ever imagine this?" Winifred asked, leaning against Zachary's solid presence. "That day when you stepped off the train in Willow Creek," Zachary chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Not in my wildest dreams. I was just looking for honest work, remember? And instead you found a stubborn widow with a failing ranch and impossible ambitions," Winifred teased. "I found the love of my life," Zachary corrected, turning to face her. "The woman who taught me that helping doesn't mean taking over and that the strongest partnerships are built on equality." Winifred reached up to touch his face, still handsome despite the lines that 10 years of Montana weather had etched around his eyes and mouth. "And you taught me that not all men propose marriage to gain property or control," she said softly. "Some just want to help." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Zachary kissed his wife with the same tenderness he had shown that first evening on the porch when possibility had blossomed between them. Around them, Richards Morgan Ranch continued its evening rhythms, cattle lowing in distant pastures, ranch hands calling to each other as they completed the day's final chores, their children's laughter floating on the cooling air. From struggling widow to respected rancher, from solitary grief to shared joy, Winifred's journey had been unexpected but profoundly fulfilling. And it had all begun with a simple question from a travel-worn cowboy. What if I just help? That question had changed everything, opening the door to a life richer and more satisfying than she could have imagined in her darkest days of mourning. With Zachary beside her and their children thriving, Winifred faced the future not with fear but with confidence, secure in the knowledge that the love they had built together was strong enough to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. As twilight deepened into night, stars appearing like diamonds scattered across the vast Montana sky, Winifred and Zachary called their children in for supper, walking hand in hand toward the warm light spilling from the windows of their home, the heart of Richards Morgan Ranch, where one man's offer of help had blossomed into a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come.